The child's breathing had changed during the night, and Aiyana knew it the moment consciousness returned to her in the pre-dawn darkness. Without even opening her eyes, she could hear the difference. The wet, labored rasping that spoke of fluid collecting where only air should flow, the irregular pauses between breaths that meant a small spirit was fighting desperately against forces trying to pull it from this world. She had been awakened not by sound, but by the profound silence that followed each of little Kaya's struggles for breath, moments that stretched too long and filled the medicine lodge with the weight of impending loss. This wasn't the end of the story, just the part we were never taught. Subscribe for more untold stories from the America of 1491. Rising from her sleeping mat with movements made careful by years of tending the sick, Aiyana pressed her ear against the child's small chest and heard what no healer ever wanted to hear. The deep, wet rattling that meant the lung-drowning sickness had progressed beyond the gentler remedies she had tried over the past 3 days. The fever that had seemed manageable when Chief Takoda first brought his youngest daughter to her lodge now threatened to steal away not just a child, but the future of the village's most important bloodline. In the darkness of her sacred space, surrounded by bundles of dried herbs hanging from smoke-darkened wooden beams and clay vessels holding the accumulated medicine wisdom of 5 generations, Aiyana faced the reality that had haunted her dreams and awakened her with the cold certainty of someone who had seen too many spirits slip away despite her best efforts. The first light of what might be Kaya's last day was already creeping through the smoke hole above, and with it came the knowledge that she had perhaps 8 hours, maybe less, before the child's spirit would be too weak to call back from whatever distant realm it was already beginning to explore. If you've ever wondered how people survived serious illness before hospitals existed, before trained doctors, before any of the medical miracles we take for granted today, stay with us as we follow one of history's most crucial medical decisions, where ancient knowledge inherited across generations meets the ultimate test of life and death in a race against time that will determine whether tradition and wisdom can triumph over the forces of mortality itself. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves as Aiyana began her morning ritual, but today every familiar action felt weighted with the crushing urgency of a life hanging in the balance. Her hands permanently stained the deep brown of countless roots and bark preparations, hands that had guided more than 40 difficult births and drawn fever from hundreds of burning foreheads, moved methodically through her collection of clay vessels and stone-grinding tools, arranged with the precision of someone who understood that organization could mean the difference between life and death when moments mattered most. The medicine lodge that had served her grandmother and her grandmother's grandmother seemed to whisper with the accumulated knowledge of generations of healers, its hide-covered walls holding the memory of countless desperate nights when families had brought their most precious burdens, seeking miracles that existed only in the careful application of plant wisdom and spirit guidance. Every bundle of dried sage and cedar hanging from the wooden beams, every carefully sorted collection of roots and bark stored in vessels made by hands, long returned to earth, every tool worn smooth by generations of use, spoke to a tradition that stretched back to the beginning times when the first healers learned to read the language of plants and translate it into human healing. Yet today, surrounded by all this accumulated wisdom, Aiyana felt the terrible inadequacy of knowledge in the face of a sickness that seemed determined to steal away the most innocent of lives. The lodge that usually felt like a sanctuary now seemed too small to contain her anxiety, and the familiar tools that had always brought comfort through their solid presence now seemed fragile and insufficient against the wet, labored breathing coming from the sleeping mat in the corner where little Kaya fought her private battle against forces that threatened to drown her from within. Little Kaya, barely 6 winters old and still carrying the rounded softness of early childhood in her small frame, had been brought to Aiyana 3 days ago when what started as nothing more troubling than a simple cough from playing too long in the cold stream had transformed into something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The child's mother, Aiyana's own cousin Winona, had tried all the usual remedies that mothers had used for countless generations, Steam rising from heated stones placed in water, warm broths made from bone marrow and healing herbs, extra layers of the softest furs to draw the sickness out through sweat. But when the fever rose and the cough began producing the thick, bloody phlegm that Aiyana recognized with a sinking heart as the unmistakable mark of the lung-drowning sickness that had claimed so many children over the years, she knew that desperate choices and dangerous remedies loomed ahead like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. As the morning light strengthened and began to chase the shadows from the corners of the lodge, Aiyana carefully examined her small patient once more, her experienced hands reading the child's body like a sacred text written in the language of illness and recovery. Kaya's skin blazed with a heat that seemed to emanate from deep within her small body, as if some internal fire had been kindled that threatened to consume her from the inside out. Dark circles shadowed her closed eyes, and her usually bright and curious face had taken on the waxy pallor that Aiyana had learned to recognize as the sign of a spirit preparing to depart from flesh that could no longer sustain it. Most troubling of all was the way Kaya's chest rose and fell in an increasingly uneven rhythm, as if her young body fought desperately against each breath while something unseen worked to steal the very air from her lungs. Aiyana had seen this particular pattern of breathing before, during the terrible winter when the lung-drowning sickness had swept through the village taking mostly the very young and very old, and she knew with the bitter certainty of experience that, without aggressive intervention, the child's lungs would continue to fill with the thick, poisonous fluid that was already stealing her strength with each increasingly labored inhalation, until finally her small chest would simply stop moving altogether, and another bright spirit would be lost to the realm of the ancestors before her time. By the time the sun had cleared the tree line and began to cast its golden light across the village, painting the bark lodge walls with patterns of shadow and brightness that normally would have brought comfort, but today seemed only to mark the passing of precious time, word of little Kaya's worsening condition had spread through the community like smoke on the wind, carried by the invisible networks of concern and kinship that bound the village together in times of crisis. Chief Takoda arrived first, his usually composed and dignified demeanor cracking like ice under spring warmth as he knelt beside his daughter's still form, his large warrior's hands trembling as they hovered over her fevered forehead without quite daring to touch, as if his very presence might somehow disturb the delicate balance between life and death that seemed to hang in the air round her small, struggling body. Behind him came Winona, the child's mother and Aiyana's own beloved cousin, a woman whose usual quick smile and bright eyes now held nothing but the particular terror that only a parent watching their child slip away could truly understand, that raw and desperate fear that cuts deeper than any physical wound and leaves scars on the spirit that never fully heal. Her face had aged years in the 3 days since first bringing Kaya to the medicine lodge, and now she moved with the careful, hesitant steps of someone afraid that any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile hope still remained. The lodge quickly filled with the murmured prayers and worried whispers of relatives and village elders, their presence both a source of comfort and an added pressure that made Aiyana's hands tremble slightly as she continued her morning assessment under so many watching eyes. There was Grandmother Nokomi's, whose ancient hands had delivered half the children in the village and who now sat in the place of honor near the fire, her weathered features grave as she watched Kaya's labored breathing and remembered other children lost to similar illnesses over her many decades of life. The child's uncles arrived together, their hunting weapons left respectfully outside as they entered the sacred space where life and death decisions were made, their usual boisterous voices reduced to respectful whispers that somehow seemed louder than shouts in the tension-filled air of the medicine lodge. Elder Chaitin, whose weathered face had witnessed more than 70 winters and whose counsel was sought whenever the village faced its gravest decisions, positioned himself with careful dignity near the entrance of the lodge and spoke in the measured, careful tones reserved for life's most serious moments. His voice carried the weight of accumulated wisdom as he reminded those gathered that Aiyana carried within her hands and memory the medicine knowledge passed down through 5 unbroken generations of healers that those same hands had successfully guided more than 40 difficult births back from the shadow realm, and had drawn countless fevers from burning foreheads, restoring health to bodies that seemed beyond hope, and calling spirits back from journeys toward the ancestor lands. Yet, even as Elder Chaitin spoke these words of confidence and public support, Aiyana caught the subtle undertone of doubt that crept into his carefully controlled voice when his eyes moved to take in little Kaya's increasingly shallow breathing, the way her small chest seemed to struggle more with each passing moment, the ominous wet rattle that spoke of corruption gathering in places where only clear breath should flow. She understood that his words were meant as much to bolster the failing hope of desperate parents as they were to publicly reaffirm faith in her abilities, and she felt the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy winter robe, warming and suffocating at the same time. The morning light continued to strengthen as it poured through the smoke hole above, illuminating motes of dust and herb-scented air, while Aiyana tried her gentler remedies first, following the ancient protocols that demanded beginning with the least dangerous treatments before moving toward more aggressive interventions. With infinite patience and growing desperation hidden behind outward calm, she brewed a careful tea from willow bark and elderflower, the steam rising from the clay vessel carrying the bitter-sweet scent of hopes that were already beginning to fade, and she coaxed small sips of the healing liquid past the child's dry, fever-cracked lips, watching for any sign that the medicine was taking hold and fighting back against whatever force was stealing the life from this small, precious body. She burned bundles of sage and cedar with the reverent precision of a ritual performed countless times, letting the purifying smoke circle around Kaya's small form while chanting the healing songs her grandmother had taught her during long winter nights when the old woman's voice had seemed to carry the wisdom of the ages itself. The familiar words felt different in her mouth today, heavy with the weight of desperation rather than buoyant with the confidence that usually accompanied their use, and she found herself wondering if the spirits could hear the fear beneath her carefully controlled tones, if they might turn away from a healer who doubted her own abilities to call them to her aid. She applied warm poultices made from crushed pine needles and bear grease to the child's chest, the aromatic paste carrying the forest scents that usually brought comfort and healing, but today seemed powerless against the corruption that was stealing Kaya's breath. Her experienced hands worked the healing mixture into the child's skin, with gentle circular motions that had soothed countless patients over the years, but despite her careful ministrations and whispered prayers, Kaya's condition remained stubbornly unchanged with each passing hour, and the wet rattle in her chest grew more pronounced, a sound that seemed to echo in the silence of the lodge like the drumbeat of approaching doom. As the sun reached its highest point in the autumn sky, casting harsh shadows through the smoke hole that seemed to mark the passage of time like marks on a counting stick, Aiyana faced the decision that would define not only this desperate day, but potentially her entire reputation as a keeper of the healing wisdom that had been entrusted to her care. Deep within her medicine bundle, wrapped with infinite care in the softest deerskin and protected by layers of sacred cedar bark, lay a collection of dried mushrooms that her grandmother had shown her only once during her training, on a night when the northern lights danced across the sky and the old woman's voice had carried the weight of generations as she spoke of remedies so powerful and dangerous that they walked the very edge between healing and death. Her grandmother had called them the spirit-walking fungi, explaining in hushed tones that they contained within their wrinkled, unremarkable forms the power to either heal the most stubborn lung ailments that defied all other treatments, or send a patient directly into the arms of the ancestors if used incorrectly or at the wrong moment. The old woman had described how these mysterious growths worked by temporarily stopping a person's breathing entirely, allowing the accumulated poisoned fluid to be drawn from the lungs through techniques that required the healer to guide the patient's spirit safely through the shadow realm and back into their body, a process so fraught with danger that many healers refused to attempt it even when faced with certain death from inaction. Winona noticed the change in Aiyana's demeanor immediately. "Cousin, you have thought of something," she said, gripping Aiyana's arm with desperate strength. "I can see it in your eyes. Whatever it is, we must try." But Chief Takoda, who had remained silent through the morning's treatments, stood slowly and fixed Aiyana with a gaze that held both trust and warning. He had heard the stories of healers who attempted the dangerous mushroom treatment, and he knew that more than half of those who tried it never awakened. The lodge fell silent except for the sound of Kaya's struggling breath as Aiyana explained the choice before them. She could continue with the gentle treatments, keeping the child comfortable but likely watching her strength slowly ebb away over the next few hours. Or she could attempt the mushroom ritual, which required preparing a precise mixture of the fungi with specific roots and honey, administering it at the exact moment when the child's body was strongest, then using breathwork and manipulation to clear the fluid from her lungs while her spirit walked between the world of the living and the realm beyond. Elder Chayton called for the formal decision-making circle that tradition required for such momentous choices. The adults arranged themselves on woven mats around the child's sleeping form while Aiyana spread her medicine tools before them. The grinding stones, the clay vessels, the carefully sorted bundles of herbs and roots that represented a lifetime of study. She spoke honestly about what the mushroom treatment would require, explaining that she would need to stop Kaya's breathing for what might feel like an eternity, trusting in her knowledge and the guidance of her ancestors to bring the child back from the edge of death. Winona spoke first, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "My daughter grows weaker with each breath. If we do nothing, I will lose her by sunset. At least this way, she has a chance." Chief Takoda remained silent for a long moment, his warrior's training warring with his father's heart. He had led men into battles where the odds were far worse than half, but those had been his own choices to make. This decision would determine whether his youngest child lived to see another dawn, and the weight of that responsibility seemed to age him years in moments. The other relatives shared their thoughts, some supporting the desperate attempt while others urged patience with the gentler remedies. But as they spoke, Kaya's breathing became even more labored, and small flecks of blood appeared on her lips when she coughed. Elder Chayton, who had seen many such gatherings over his long life, finally raised his hand for silence. "The spirits have already given us their answer," he said, gesturing toward the child's deteriorating condition. "If we wait much longer, there will be no strength left for any treatment to work." With the decision made, Aiyana moved with the focused precision of someone who understood that hesitation could mean death. She sent the younger relatives away, keeping only Chief Takoda, Winona, and Elder Chayton to assist with what would require absolute concentration. From her medicine bundle she withdrew the dried mushrooms, dark, wrinkled things that looked unremarkable but contained the power to walk between life and death. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory as she began the careful process of grinding them into powder, measuring the amount with a precision that came from understanding that too little would be useless while too much would be fatal. The preparation took nearly an hour as Aiyana combined the mushroom powder with specific roots that would help guide the child's spirit safely back to her body. She added honey not just for taste but for its properties of preservation and healing, creating a thick paste that she tested carefully on her own tongue to ensure the balance was correct. As she worked, she chanted the songs her grandmother had taught her, the ancient words that were said to call upon the protective spirits who watched over such dangerous healings. When the medicine was ready, Aiyana knelt beside the child and gently lifted her head. Kaya's eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused with fever, but still aware enough to recognize her healer's face. "Little one," Aiyana whispered, "you are going to take a journey, but I will guide you home." With infinite care she administered the medicine, holding the child as the strange mixture took effect and watching as Kaya's already labored breathing began to slow even further. What happened next tested every piece of knowledge Aiyana had inherited from her lineage of healers. As the mushroom medicine took hold, Kaya's breathing became so shallow it was almost imperceptible, and her body grew limp in a way that made Winona cry out in terror. But Aiyana had expected this. It was the necessary first step that would allow her to clear the poisoned fluid from the child's lungs. Working quickly, she began the intricate process of positioning Kaya's body to drain the corruption that had been slowly drowning her from within. Using techniques passed down through generations, Aiyana manipulated the child's small form, applying pressure to specific points while encouraging the infected fluid to drain from her lungs. It was delicate work that required her to trust completely in her training, as one wrong movement could cause the child's spirit to slip away entirely. Chief Takoda held his daughter's hands while Winona supported her head, both parents watching in terrified fascination as Aiyana worked with the focused intensity of someone performing a sacred ritual. The most difficult part came when Kaya stopped breathing entirely. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only moments, the child lay completely still while Aiyana used her breathwork training to gradually coax life back into the small body. She placed her mouth over Kaya's and breathed her own life force into the child's lungs, timing each breath with the precision her grandmother had taught her. Between these breathing treatments, she continued to work on draining the fluid, and gradually the thick infected material began to emerge from the child's throat. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, casting golden light through the lodge's entrance, Kaya drew her first independent breath in what felt like hours. It was shallow and weak, but it was her own, and the terrible wet rattle that had marked her breathing all day was notably diminished. Aiyana felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly as she watched the child's chest rise and fall in a more natural rhythm, though she knew they were not yet safe from danger. The next few hours would be crucial as Kaya's body adjusted to breathing freely again, and her spirit fully returned from whatever realm it had visited during the treatment. Aiyana prepared gentle broths and teas to help restore the child's strength, while monitoring every breath for signs that the dangerous fluid might be returning to her lungs. Chief Takoda and Winona maintained their vigil, taking turns holding their daughter's hands and whispering prayers of gratitude to the spirits who had guided Aiyana's hands through the perilous healing. As darkness fell and the lodge was lit by the warm glow of the central fire, Kaya's eyes opened with a clarity that had been absent for days. She was weak and would need careful tending for many days to come, but the immediate crisis had passed. The fever had broken, her breathing came easily, and when Aiyana offered her a small sip of healing tea, the child was able to swallow without difficulty. The medicine had worked, and the dangerous gamble had paid off with the most precious possible reward. In the peaceful darkness that followed, as the village settled into sleep knowing their chief's daughter would see another dawn, Aiyana cleaned her tools and returned her medicines to their proper places. Her hands shook slightly as the full weight of what she had accomplished settled into her awareness. She had walked to the very edge of death with a child and guided them both safely home, using knowledge that existed nowhere in the world except in the memories and hands of healers like herself. Chief Takoda approached as she finished her work, and without words, he placed a hand on her shoulder in the gesture of deepest respect reserved for those who had proven themselves in the most crucial moments. Winona embraced her cousin with tears of gratitude streaming down her face, knowing that without Aiyana's courage to attempt the dangerous treatment, this night would have ended very differently. Elder Chaitin, who had witnessed the entire ordeal, nodded his approval and murmured words of praise for the healing tradition that had preserved yet another precious life. As Aiyana finally allowed herself to rest beside the fire, listening to the sound of Kaya's peaceful breathing, she thought about the responsibility she carried as keeper of this ancient medical knowledge. Tomorrow, she would begin teaching her own niece the properties of the healing plants and the songs that guided dangerous treatments, ensuring that future generations would have access to the wisdom that had saved a life this day. In a world without hospitals or trained physicians, healers like Aiyana stood as the only barrier between illness and death, carrying in their hands and memories the accumulated medical knowledge of countless generations. The fire burned low as the night deepened, and in its fading glow, Aiyana reflected on the delicate balance between courage and caution that defined a healer's path. Today's success would become part of her legacy, another story to guide future healers facing similar impossible choices. But she also knew that with each life saved came the weight of greater expectations, and tomorrow might bring another desperate family seeking miracles that existed only in the careful application of ancient wisdom and the willingness to risk everything for the chance to preserve life. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the village slept peacefully around them, Aiyana kept watch over her young patient and planned the gentle treatments that would guide Kaya's complete recovery. The immediate crisis had passed, but true healing would require patience, careful observation, and continued application of the medicine knowledge that had already proven its worth in the most dramatic possible way. As the first birds began their morning songs, announcing the approach of another day, both healer and patient rested in the satisfaction of a battle won against death itself.